Thank you very much, Katrina. Anna, you all right? I can hear you. I can see you. Yeah, brilliant. Great. Hello, Anna. Anna and I, we deliver our kind of training that we do together, and I hope you can see the slides okay. So I'm the founder and CEO of Integrate Mental Health. I'm also a clinical tutor at the Hertfordshire course very recently, and a clinical psychologist. And Anna, who introduced yourself?
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm Anna. I'm also a clinical psychologist by background and director of Integrate, and I work also in the NHS part-time. So I've got different hats today, but I'm here from the Integrate perspective.
That's brilliant, thank you. And as always, we really humbly acknowledge our Integrate Mental Health peers who share their stories with us in the work that we do, which we're going to tell you a little bit more about, and from whom we learn. So we have our own lived experience of mental health difficulties, and that we'll tell a little bit more about how that brings us, how it gave birth to Integrate Mental Health, etc., and what we do. But also we're really joined by a very powerful group of people who we are honoured to be in touch with in the mental health professions, who have their own lived experience. So thank you to you out there, because I know some of you might be here today. So that's really important. I'm just going to stop sharing for a moment, because we don't like to share slides when we're saying things about our own lived experience. So I hope that's eased up the view a little bit here. So we always start with stories, because I think stories are really powerful. So I'm going to say something, then Anna will choose what she wants to say today. And we say different things different days, don't we, Anna?
Yeah, definitely.
Depending on how we're feeling and all our options and choices around sharing, which we've talked a little bit about today, and we might get to as well. So I broke down when I was working in service as a clinical psychologist back in 2015. And when that happened, and it was for those of us who use kind of formulation language, it was an integrative formulation of both personal issues arising from outside of work, and also some very deleterious systemic issues from within the service that I was operating in. The service was undergoing mergers, changes. We didn't have access to rooms at one point. We certainly weren't heard by commissioning as to how these new ideas about doing things were going to impact on us actually doing the things that we were doing on the front line. And as a team, we were sinking. This is all, I want you to kind of move your minds before COVID was even a thing. Okay, we're going back, and we're going to continue to broaden this narrative out. I broke down. I've been in analysis. I was in analysis for over 12 years. I chose to do that the year before I started training for very personal reasons. And also it's a very personal value of mine that if I'm going to walk through doing mind work with minds, then I will attend to my mind also. To me, the synchronicity between my mind and another mind I'm working with is absolute. So we do the work and we do the work in both ways. So this was also fundamental to me practicing at all in mental health. When I broke down, I had good support actually from my manager and also from my clinical supervisor. But what I didn't have, which led to very, very difficult extra layer of pain on top of my own personal pain, was any kind of wider support, acknowledgement, validation of what it was to be a mental health professional who breaks down. You know, we're not supposed to break down. We're supposed to hold everybody else. But of course, this is complete nonsense, because we all just are human beings who live lives. So that is a key message that we'll bring today. There was complete silence in the scene. There were no even neutral norms or narratives around this, let alone any positive ones. There was no support at all from professional bodies. There was no positioning from them back in that time. And there was very little interest out there. And it's been that for the longest time. So it's only since we've got to the stage that we have now in the pandemic, as has been spoken about earlier today, that we've got any kind of highlight on this in a way that's sensible in my mind. And I fell into a very desperate state of pain, and I was in trauma. And it took me really quite some time to recover, with help and support, which included mind peer support, some access to secondary care services, my own analyst, and all of that as and when I could even move off the couch. I left my job, I lost my home, I was on benefits, and my dog, I moved home with my parents, my dog became a recovery dog, and he didn't even know that that was going to be in his repertoire when he was a pup, but he did beautifully, and he helped me to learn to even walk again. So it was, everything that I experienced was a complete breakdown. And for me, because it was held in the cradle of analysis, meaning making was happening all the time. I had a fantastic relationship with her. I feel very lucky that that was the case. And I was able to make sense of what was going on eventually. And that helped me to transform some aspects of my experience which had come up for healing, which had actually needed to come up for healing. I didn't need to hit the wall so hard and fast, but I think that's due to some systems issues around me, which put me up against it very quickly. But nevertheless, when I look back at my breakdown, I see it as a breakthrough, and I see it as enhancing of my personal wisdom and of what I give back now in terms of the work we do with the profession. But I was desperately isolated, desperately felt cast out by the profession, who was stigmatizing of this. And out of these desperate feelings came a desperate need for connection. And so and then an anger as well, because I was like, what is this paradox? What is this? And this is where we get into our version of moral injury, which I passed by Neil Greenberg, which is the sense that we work in a profession that knows the difference. We've got the skills, okay? We know the difference. We know we're all flipping human beings. So why should anybody feel cast out? And so I became very angry, and I used that anger to then go out on Twitter all that time ago, connect with people. Is there anyone out there like me? Even listen to that language I was still using then. That you'll never hear that shit from me ever again. Connected with the people out there, and they began to come, and I thought, well, I've got to harness this in some way. This is precious. And every time someone connected with me, I cried. Every single, I was still like barely off the couch, you know. And so I wanted somewhere to put people that felt safe. So Wix. So I built a Wix website, very rudimentary, had the original forum in it. And because I'm adopted, I know what it means to have a safe base, because I had that ripped away from me when I was very young. So I know what it means to have containment and to not have containment. I know what it means to welcome people in who feel like they're carrying a lot of shame. I understand that. So my lived experience of very primary trauma has enabled me to get into doing something that I feel just was around connecting. How do we make those precious spaces safe? To move on, I ended up lobbying the scene because I couldn't tolerate the paradox in it. I couldn't tolerate the lack of looking at itself and holding up the mirror. Same as we're seeing with racism in our professions now. It's the same thing. You need to hold up the mirror to look within, because we ain't going to get nowhere without doing that. And so I ended up getting involved in the British Psychological Society to work on policies, because you do need to also get stuff into writing. Kind of annoyingly, part of me says, because I'm so grassroots focused, I feel like stories. I go with an oral tradition if I could, but unfortunately we deal with journals and stuff like that. And so Integrate was born basically out of it. And we needed to really start to think about, how do we operationalize around disconnection, disjunct, stigma? How do we get people into connection? How do we understand our place as professional regulated, and we'll talk about HCPC because that's important, mental health professionals, alongside also this experiential knowledge that we all bring, all different, you know, some of them more or less experienced of services, etc. Whatever, wherever you're at, it's all good. So you know, how do we start to challenge this? before I go on, because I really can, I'm going to hand over to Anna for Anna to speak to her experience of and position, how she got here. Thank you.
Thank you, Natalie. So I sort of joined Integrate a bit later on in the curve. So I had a breakdown, as I call it, sort of very, very early in my career. It was about a year after I qualified. And again, a bit like Natalie, was a bit of a combination of what was going on in the service, working in a really stretched NHS setting, and some personal things that were going on in my life. And I started experiencing sort of quite a lot of distress. There were other bits and pieces that were quite triggering, sort of as I was working with people. And I got to a point where I just couldn't continue anymore. Took some time off. And what was really stark at that point was how, in some ways, unusual it felt to everybody that as a clinical psychologist, I could also experience distress to the point that I needed to step away. That I was human, that I was, experiencing symptoms of something that was more than, your burnout or sort of the general well-being narrative that we sometimes hear around in services. So I felt completely, when I took time off, one of the first ever things that happened was that I really, really had to fight to come back to work. So I was seeing colleagues with physical health complaints that were taking time off, were having an occupational health assessment, and were allowed to return when they decided it was fit for them to return. I, on the other hand, was questioned from start to finish about whether I had, almost as if I had lost the capacity to make my own decisions at that point. So the fight started. The little fight that was still in me sort of, continued on. I sought support at that point, managed to come back to work, sought my own personal therapy, but it didn't end there. When I returned, it was a constant questioning of what is going on, sort of really unhelpful narratives around how can a clinical psychologist sort of be reduced to that point, or if you can't explain it to us, then who can? Almost as if I was the holder of all the knowledge at that point and was supposed to know exactly what was happening for me, even though I was still navigating it myself. And, a lot of around stigma has been mentioned today. Some of what happened at that point because of these narratives is stigma, mental health stigma really got in me. And I started feeling all of the things that I was hearing from everybody else. So I felt very much like questioning my ability to practice, had I suddenly become incompetent? What was going on with me? Until the point where I went to an event, and Natalie and I found ourselves this weekend back in the same place. But I ended up in an event that was organized partly by the British Psychological Society, and Natalie was speaking from her own experience. And there was a lovely sharing of stories of how it was actually really normal and understandable for, clinical psychologists and mental health professionals to also be human beings, as if that had to be said. Now it seems a little bit bizarre to me, but something really turned at that point, and I became very angry at the fact that I'd internalized all of that stigma, and that was even a thing in a service that was, trust, there was a mental health trust that should have known better. So at that point, I really felt a lift of something, that got out of me. And I was able to position that back in the scene, and at the same time, sort of seeing what I needed to work through, but also what was part of what I was carrying for, a service that had very stigmatized attitude. So that's when I first connected to Integrate. And then through that, Natalie and I sort of continued to connect and eventually decided to formalize the company that is Integrate today. And, from that anger, really channeling something about what is it that we're holding ourselves, but also what needs to change into the system, really taking a more systemic approach in understanding lived experience, but also valuing lived experience, because that's a lot of what was missing for me, that the value that whole experience eventually brought, the experience of going through pain and back. So I'll stop there for now because I'm mindful of time, but that's my journey to Integrate. And, there's a sadness in having been through that and almost having my eyes opened to what was going on really in my profession, especially, and the mental health scene. but also something quite lovely about having come to integrate into a very, very different narrative around it that we're hoping to continue through the work and through some of our conversations today.
That's lovely, Anna. Thank you. And we listen to our stories and they're different each time, like, well, different nuances or different foregroundings each time. It's really nice to hear. And you mentioned something I forgot, brilliant, which was about the lift that you experienced on the validation of what is essentially internalized stigma, which we're going to talk about. And Anna talked about it as a lift then. I had the same thing when it was acknowledged by the chair of the UK DCP that I went to see at the time and lobbied, much to his delight. He's been a brilliant supporter himself. And, you know, I felt, I called it a turn, because we needed to have that validated. You know what, that's now what we're going to do, what we are doing with other people. So I'm going to share slides again, and just bear with me 1 second. I've got an extra monitor in my life, so everything's a bit new. All right, just one moment. Okay, so what we really want to do is to continue to broaden out from this NHS wellbeing narrative that we've been hearing. I'm looking over there because that's where my monitor is. From a tendency to reduce staff experiences to only factors of workforce burnout or an organisational syndrome, and only focusing on daily mental hygiene, i.e. lunch breaks and hydration, which is an indictment of the very health professions that we work in itself, but there we go. What we want to do is to fully contextualise the humanity of the workforce, to normalise mental health difficulties, that anyone can struggle in the face of life's challenges at any time due to challenging life factors inside and outside, and, you know, from a long time ago, work, right? For mental health difficulties only occurring due to this nightmare that is COVID, and it is a nightmare. I don't want to erase any of that, but what I'm saying is, let's think bigger, longer, further, history and the future. So to mental health difficulties, having always been in the human workforce in the past, they are right now, and they will be in the future. And it would take writing a raft of social inequalities to change any of that. So these are the people that we have in our workforce. We want to move from rigid ideas of, oh, can you just go away and fix yourself and return, please? And, you know, don't talk about it. You know, we want to move from that to a reflection on how the workplace, as one place, but the workplace is one part of a healing journey, honouring recovery that's needed, that having lived experience of staff mental health systems and team responses integrated into improving that same system is important, and seeing the value of lived experience or experiential knowledge as enhancing of policy and practice. And we want to move, as has been said before, thank God, from an individual employee focus to challenging structural stigma, the othering of mental health vulnerability into patients and service users, sorry, I can't see the bottom of the thing, the othering of mental health vulnerability into patients and service users only, while sitting next to colleagues who have lived experience of the same, perhaps diagnosis or narrative or whatever's coming up. You know, the vulnerability, as we know today, and as I'm sure we're more getting used to now, is definitely not outside the room. Okay. Anna, do you want to?
Yeah, so we've touched on stigma a lot today, and, you know, really what I want to say about stigma is the power that it can have. And I was mentioning a little bit before, you know, often what mental health stigma can do is it creates an additional layer of pain, really. You know, not only you're left dealing and managing your own personal pain and what is going on for you in moments that you find yourself in lives, but there's also this additional, you know, massive pain that stigma can create, and when it's internalized, that's even worse often, because you start believing what stigma is saying. And, you know, there's loads of misconceptions there. You know, the misconceptions around mental health, people with mental health difficulties being dangerous, you know, behaving unpredictably, being incompetent. And sometimes, you know, in mental health professionals, that can be that additional layer of mental health stigma, which is around the not being allowed to break down. And you know, others have spoken today about how that's a massive barrier often for help, and how it can kill people. You know, we've seen that tragically happen a lot in recent times, and reported more and more so. So that's really all I want to say. I'm a bit mindful of time, and I know we've touched a lot on stigma, but yeah, just to hold in mind really the importance and the power that it can have.
Okay, thank you. And so we challenge systems. So we're going to talk a bit about what we do. It ranges from the peer grassroots level all the way up through systems. So we challenge systems to take a whole systems approach from grassroots activism to influence structural stigma change. And we know that you have to pick it all off. You know, if anybody who's, you know, used to looking at Bronfenbrenner's ecological model, that's our dartboard. It's like, who do we need to engage with and where are our messages going? And as has been said before, the main approaches are consumer contact. So consumer is an American word for, you know, people with lived experience, you know, all those who are using services, contact, education, and protest, which we love. So we really do identify ourselves here as kind of activists in this area. This is a bit about what we do. Anna, do you want to say?
Yeah, so as we were saying, you know, we work very much systemically. So we engage with our peers through mentoring and group mentoring. We have a peer space that is running at the moment. We've engaged with sort of different professional bodies, regulators. We do a lot of training and teaching for different training institutions, and have some contacts with trusts and the public, you know, in terms of more activism work, because you know, this work shouldn't just sit with the individual, really. Change needs to happen at a systemic level if we're really going to try and change responses and reactions to, you know, mental health professionals breaking down and the general public, you know, and their view on mental health difficulties, really. Yeah.
And the regulators is a big one. So we're hoping to do some work with the HCPC because they need to destigmatize it. You know, they need to get a message out. Internalized stigma, there's more on these. I think these slides will go out, but it's just basically when we are framing this quite rightly as an individual manifestation of a deleterious social phenomenon. It starts out there, it gets in when you're in your most vulnerable moments. If you agree with that, that's going to give you an extra layer of weight. And it's a real qualitative extra experience that you can feel of pain on top of things. Let's hold intersectionality in mind. So Kimberly Crenshaw's work on those who have, what it does is it basically presents an opportunity to draw attention to structural level issues in social justice and focus on interlocking systems of oppression and the need to work towards structural level changes, all of which, so if stigma, inequality, you know, if I'm a white middle class woman, so in many areas I'm structurally inherently privileged, but experiencing mental health difficulties, that's going to set me back. So that you can imagine that there are other people who, and plenty of people who are navigating many hurdles in terms of discrimination in this area. Let's talk about us and them. So us and them polarization is basically predicated on the idea that there's two static different human populations, which of course doesn't make any sense, you know, so us, them, you know, black, white, over there, but, you know, whatever it is. And for us, you know, people who are providers of mental health services, if we have mental health difficulties, it invalidates, silences and shames the experience that we have. It says the breakdown is to be weak and shameful. This split here maintains an idealization of healthcare professionals, that we must be perfectly processed all the time, 24 hours, as if we are the service, you know, that we're working for, which we're not. We can't say we're breaking down, and it undermines our experiential knowledge. For this othered, them, vulnerable category over there maintains a real denigration, and you know, this is embodied by people who use services who aren't supposed to be mental health professionals, but of course we all are in and out. You know, as forever weak or broken, silences narratives of hope or recovery, and undermines transitions of people who've used services into the professions as well. And if you kind of scope out even wider, if you're looking at this, it's a massive tell. You know, what do we think of lived experience in our healthcare professions? Actually, if we're denigrating it or splitting like this, you know, what we're saying is actually we don't really value experiential knowledge. And then how does that sit with our attempts to kind of properly co-design services? Forked tongue. There's nonsense going on. So we need to be really aware of this, and to speak and to be open and to be honest. It does that. I'm just going to show you this, which is some amalgamated and anonymized stories from the peers through the years here at Integrate Mental Health. It's just a couple of minutes of some of the things, particularly within clinical psychology, because that's where we started. just feeling cast away as if nothing to offer. This quote on the side there, they would deem me too complex for the very service that they run. It's just, you know, I don't say I have a mental health problem as a professional. The trust I work with wouldn't know what to do with that. You know, I was so proud of my recovery, but I can't tell a soul. How terrible is this? I mean, my recovery was a part of, you know, everything that then grew me into the work that I do now. I can't be a clinical psychologist. I'm not perfect, you know. Ah, Katrina, thank you. Okay, we're just going to move on there. So that's some of the work we've done top down in terms of getting involved with policy. Why do people share? From basically from local and public activism to sharing it for peer support or sharing in clinical supervision. Be aware of your rights are protected under the Equality Act, and you do have options and choices about what to share. We also acknowledge that some people haven't, if they've been under section. We worked with people who've just come off wards and they, you know, have a different experience of that. So I want to acknowledge that. But talking about our lived experience can really help common humanity happen in our community. We are not all different in this. We are in and out of services. We are in and out of distress fluidly, depending on what goes on in our lives. Let's just please open up to that. What we want to show you here before we finish is the trailer from our In Conversation With series. This was something that was a lockdown 1 project, and we got in touch with different mental health professionals, not just psychologists, also mental health nurses and psychiatrists with lived experience of mental health difficulties here in Australia and in the UK. And we actually mentor some people in Australia at the moment. They're amazing, and I hope you can hear everything.
Yes, I have lived experience of mental health difficulties, and I'm a mental health practitioner, and I can be both.
My training urged us to keep those two things separate and sort of forgot I was the one whole human being.
I've had bipolar disorder for 15 years, and it's okay.
You want to say this is hard, but how is that received when you say it? When you're saying it as a black person, it tends to get received in a very different way.
I felt that if I did disclose, it would in some way harm my chances as a professional. I'm going to be seen as a risk right away. I'm going to be seen as less competent.
I specialize in trauma. Because I've lived through trauma, it gives me that better connection with my clients. It's my superpower in a way.
Of course, it's not essential. I just think it gives me a different perspective, you know.
I wouldn't say, oh, I wish I'd never had it. I wouldn't be the person I am today if I'd not gone through all that. It does make you more resilient. It does make you more reflective. It does make you understand yourself better.
Until you experience it, it's another world. If you're sectioned, you kind of lose your rights and things get done to you, and lots of things helped. But when I managed to return to education, I thought I want to try and make a difference and go back into the mental health system and promote a more listening approach.
It just struck me how much we still battle with stigma and shame.
It feels really significant, and I guess that reflects the culture and the stigma that is very much prevalent in our workforce every single day.
The mental health systems and the mental health scene, it must open up to the humanity of the workforce.
I just think it's extraordinary that we spend all of our time talking about the stigma that patients and service users experience, and then we stigmatise ourselves and each other.
From being a mental health nurse, and I knew all those things and I still struggled, it makes me think about the people that don't have that awareness of the systems and things as well.
This series will help provide empowered narratives that people can get alongside and listen to. Where lived experience enhances our professional practice, it's really normal and common amongst all of us, and really opens the eyes of the system to its value.
As a clinical psychologist, how can I expect my patients, but also the general public, to talk about their mental health if us as the mental health worker can't do that?
Thank you very much for watching that. We're everywhere if you want to find us, come and say hello. And I don't know if we've got time for questions. I'll leave it up to Katrina to take it from here.
Thank you, everyone.